Alrighty, shall we
Great.
get started?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, B. I will just open with a karakia. If you wouldn't mind just moving to that slide, B. Thank you. So whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. Ihi aki ana te ata kura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei, mauri ora. Thanks, B. So kia ora koutou, welcome everyone and thank you for attending today. We know that people have very busy schedules and we know also that we are very near on approaching the new APC cycle, so we do appreciate everyone attending. So today we'll be covering, firstly, just a bit of an overarching context for the ePortfolio responsibilities of yourselves as part of the ePortfolio and cycle and of the third party and ePortfolio supervisor as well. Having a little look at the resources that are available to you and then some Q&A. So if you do have any partai either now or throughout the webinar, please do put them into the chat, the Q&A function down the bottom, and we'll address those at the end. So I'm Naomi, I'm one of the professional advisors, Kaitohutohu Ngaio, Tangata Tiriti, and you'll see the names of my colleagues, Shaz Bryan and Carolyn Simmons as well, who are our other professional advisors. And we'll be joined a little bit later as well by Tony, who's our registrations manager and manager of the audit process, and they'll pop in the Q&A at the end. Thanks, B. So just to start, as many of you will be aware, the health practice in New Zealand is governed by this overarching act, piece of legislation, the HPCAA Act, of which the core function is to protect the health and safety of members of the public. And under this act, there are 18 designated regulatory authorities, of which we are one. And our role obviously relates to kaiwhakaora ngangahau, so occupational therapists who are registered and practicing in New Zealand. Now, there are a number of functions that we have or hold responsibility for in regards to our profession, and you can check those out under section 118. But they are quite broad and span right from kind of accrediting education programs to receiving notifications, and then all of kind of the in-between around registering, recertifying, and ensuring the competence and fitness of our profession. Next slide, thanks, B. So in terms of the legislative link for the ePortfolio, so the ePortfolio is recognised and mandated as a recertification program, which relates to Section 41 of the Act, and that's around undertaking a systemic process to ensure the ongoing fitness and competence of our profession. For us, obviously our profession, for other RAs, their own. So that is the link. So every registered practicing occupational therapist, when they are applying for their practicing certificate, that is part of the recertification process to apply and renew your APC or to a short-term practicing certificate as well. So as we know, the ePortfolio is a reflective practice cycle, and the reason for this is very intentional. So short of being able to witness the practice of every practicing occupational therapist in Aotearoa, we need a process or an overarching kind of tool by which we can attest to the competence or ensure the competence of our profession. And we use a reflective practice framework so that it can incorporate and be applied across our very diverse profession and the range of different practice areas that we practice across. It is a tool that can be individualized and that can be applied to very specific and different contexts. Obviously, the resource that it does require is time. However, it is not it doesn't require necessarily any particular CPD kind of funding, etc., which can be really difficult for people who are practicing, say, in private practice fields or do not have access to that for other reasons. So it is kind of an overarching process and tool that can be utilized by anyone who is practicing, regardless of practice area. Now, the intent of the ePortfolio is just to provide a snapshot of practice. So it's not around recording every single bit of professional development that you are doing or that you have done, unless, of course, you want to use the ePortfolio in that way. So for people who do want to use it in that way, they are welcome to. However, we'll talk later through the cycle. We are just requiring a snapshot in terms of what we ask. And the ePortfolio, as we know, works within a high trust model. So as part of our recertification, kind of under Section 41, as part of that recertification program, you do make legally binding self-declarations when you apply for your APC, which relate to your engagement in the ePortfolio, as does your third party and your supervisor. Your third party within the ABC process and your supervisor through their statements, which we'll talk to a little bit later as well. And of course, we'll all be aware of and familiar with probably the ePortfolio audits, which is another mechanism by which we have oversight of people's engagement within the ePortfolio. Thanks, B. So the responsibilities are vast. So first and foremost, within the My OTBNZ practitioner portal. So really important to make sure that your personal details, contact information, but also your work history is up to date. So the locations and areas within which you are working and the hours and things associated with that. You are required to have an accepted supervisor nomination within the first 3 months of practice within an ePortfolio cycle. So anyone who is continuing with the same ePortfolio supervisor that they have now, you will need to re-nominate that supervisor once we hit the 1st of April and once we start with the new ePortfolio cycle. Your supervisor then needs to complete supervisor statements within 6 months of practice. So while obviously it's the role of the supervisor to accept a nomination or decline that, whatever they do, and to complete these statements, it is your role to ensure and to check that you do have an accepted nomination and that your supervisor has made those statements. And a really easy way to check in regards to the statements is to look for the red tick, which you'll see beside that name there. When you see a red tick beside your supervisor's name, that means that they have completed the supervisor statements. So an easy wee signpost there. Now, of course, ePortfolio supervisors, there are different requirements for different people who are practicing, for example, under a recertification program versus not. So check out the supervision standards, which are on our website, which lays all of that out in terms of who can be your ePortfolio supervisor or not. And as part of our practicing certificate renewal process, I've already talked to, you have to make a self-declaration regarding your own fitness and competence and engagement in the ePortfolio, as does your third party. So your role there is really nominating your third party and making sure you're doing your own self-declaration as part of that process. Thanks, B. So the reflective practice cycle is obviously your kind of predominant or the biggest responsibility, if you like. And if we look at this definition of competency by Mills, the ePortfolio is really underpinned by that premise that actually competency is an ongoing process. It's not a destination that you hit, and rather that is something that requires you to kind of maintain and to be engaging in continuous professional development and integrating new knowledge and skills into practice to maintain your competence and to ensure that that is ongoing. And as we can see within this reflective cycle, which is the ePortfolio cycle, is that kind of occurs within a stepwise fashion. So first and foremost, you need to be thinking about and reflecting upon what is your practice context and what are your own skills and knowledge. Once you've identified skill and knowledge gaps, then being clear around what is that specific gap, and then what are the specific things that you will do or that you need to do in order to fill that gap and hit that kind of goal that you're needing to achieve. The usefulness of kind of skills and knowledge is really, I guess, observed or becomes apparent through observation of what actually happens in practice when we apply these new skills and knowledge. So are there changes in the way that I practice? Are there different outcomes for people that I'm working with? What actually happens once those things are integrated? Sometimes that's expected and sometimes it's unexpected, the outcomes that occur. And that's where we lead into critical reflection. So thinking about kind of what did happen, what was that process like? Did this uncover any new gaps, etc.? What might I need to work on next? So this self-reflective cycle, as you're all aware, we require you to engage in this cycle for each of the 5 competencies. And we'll talk to each of the areas in a second. But basically 5 full reflective plans make up a full ePortfolio over the 2-year cycle. Now, you need to have one active goal. There's an expectation that you're working on kind of one goal at any one time, or at least one goal at any one time. So you don't need to be working on everything all at once. It might be that you focus on competency 3, for example, first, kind of do what you need to do there. But the expectation generally is that you've got one active at any time in the ePortfolio cycle until such a time that you've completed a reflective cycle for each of the 5 competencies. In terms of just the upload and any documents that are uploaded in the ePortfolio, just within practice, kind of privacy and consent remain pertinent. So making sure that there is no identifiable information in anything that you do upload, other obviously than your own name or details. And making sure that you do have consent if relevant to upload any documents as well. Competency 2. So this is one, I guess, that frequently comes up in audit. So competency 2 must relate exclusively to working with or preparing to work with Māori. So you don't need to be working in a setting where you are actively working with Māori clients in order to be evidencing learning and development in regards to this competency. Competency 2 includes reflection and kind of work and development in regards to your own awareness and insight in relation to equity, te tiriti o waitangi, thinking about your own biases and attitudes that may impact upon potential or future practice. So if you are not working with Māori, that's not a problem in terms of meeting this competency. It's about preparing to work with Māori in a safe and effective way. And being really clear, and just to kind of reiterate this point, so this is a competency for working with Māori only. So if you are reflecting upon working with different cultures, that would come under a different competency. Thanks, B. So reflective practice. So within the ePortfolio, we have, I guess, layers of kind of reflective practice and reflection occurring. So before action, we're thinking around your self-assessment. During action, we're thinking about kind of your engagement in your ePortfolio supervision. And after action, we're thinking around what's in your outcomes and critical reflection. And it's that kind of integration of all of these different layers of learning that lead to kind of your professional development and changes in competence, and of course then benefits for your kirataki or people that you're working with. Thanks, B. We're whipping through, so we're just making sure we get through everything. So just focusing specifically now on the different sections for self-assessment. So, and these are, I guess, we're kind of basing off what we have seen or kind of uncovered in audit and coaching. So some of this may seem common sense, and also a lot of this is things that are missed in the ePortfolio that come through to us in terms of coaching. So a self-assessment really just needs to set the scene for whatever your goal is, and identifying in a clear and logical way, providing rationale for whatever the goal might be. In terms of performance indicators, so you do not need to reflect on every single performance indicator under every competency. What you need to be doing is selecting and reflecting on the ones that are pertinent or relevant to your self-assessment and goal. So that might be 1, it might be 3. It really does depend on what you're choosing to focus on, but you most definitely do not need to include a self-assessment in regards to every indicator. And a good self-assessment has 2 kind of parts. So first and foremost is context. And if we think about an auditor coming in to read somebody's ePortfolio, having that overarching statement of what your practice has looked like thus far. So for example, I've worked for X years as an occupational therapist across X, Y, and Z settings, currently working in XYZ setting, and have done that for this long. So just providing a bit of an overarching understanding of your career to date that gives a bit of that context. And if you just do that in competency 1 is that overarching statement, that's really useful for people who are coming in like us or like auditors who might not have that knowledge of you and your practice. Now, in terms of context for competency 1 to 5, so in addition to that overarching statement, what we need people to do is to be identifying the context that supports the relevance of their goal. So It might be, for example, outlining that you're a new graduate occupational therapist, that you're working in a rural community mental health team, and that there's a requirement for you to engage in an after-hours duty roster. Or you might be a clinician working in that same team who's expected to provide some coaching to junior clinicians around risk assessment. Or you might be a lecturer kind of working or teaching on a second year paper within which you need to teach critical reflection. You might be a senior leader tasked with a particular change process. So it's just giving a wee bit of context around your mahi so that the next part kind of makes sense. And the next part is around competence. So in relation to the context that you've just outlined, what are your existing skills and knowledge? What are you good at and what are you already doing well? Then identifying what are the gaps. So, what do you know that you need to work on, and how do you know that? Have you received feedback from people? Is this something that you've discovered yourself or kind of realized yourself? As humans, we do obviously have blind spots. And so incorporating feedback from other people, whether that be kirataki or colleagues or managers, to really think about and make sure that you've got access to all of the different perspectives when you are doing a self-assessment around competence. Sometimes our idea of our own practice can be different to others. And so making sure that within the self-assessment, you evidence, have you actually integrated feedback from other people that you're working with or alongside. So with competence, when you are thinking about, so what am I doing? What kind of knowledge and skills and attributes do I already have? And then what are the gaps? It doesn't need to be necessarily very long, but it's just giving enough information that the goal then makes sense. So if we think back to those contexts that I described, so the new graduate occupational therapist, they might feel quite comfortable and confident in terms of a general initial assessment process, but not have sufficient knowledge or skills or experience in terms of specific risk assessment. Or for the senior clinician, it might be that they are really comfortable and confident and have the skills to conduct risk assessments, but actually the new part for them is around providing coaching or advice to junior clinicians. For our lecturer, it might be that you are very comfortable and used to engaging in reflective practice processes or teaching critical reflection kind of within a supervision context, but that you've never done that within a large group before, or never kind of taught the skill itself before. And for our senior leader, it might be more around you're proficient with particular areas of a change process, but this might be a new process or a new area for you. So it's really laying out what is the context and then what are the things that I need to be working on. The ePortfolio is not just about doing what you're doing and not doing anything different. It's around evidencing that you are developing skills. And so obviously in order for that to be reflected on, you need to be talking about gaps and areas for development rather than just saying this is my job and this is one of the things that I need to do. And as within the green box, you need to have a self-assessment recorded within each of the competency areas within the first 3 months. A question that we often get asked is, how much do I need to write? And so for some people, this can literally be a few sentences. If your sentences are clear around what's the context and what are the gaps, then a few sentences can be enough. Some of the best self-assessments I've read have been kind of 4 sentences long. Or it might be that you need more words and sentences to explain the context and competence in a way that's sufficient to understand the goal. So it's more around kind of the content than the length in terms of how long things need to be. Thanks, V. Now the goals are really what we need you to be doing is to be outlining a statement of a specific area of change or development to or within your practice, or what you are intending to achieve or have been done differently. The rationale for your goals, so that in order to sits within your self-assessment, not within your goal. So the goal should really just be kind of a one sentence of what are you wanting to be different within your practice. It sounds obvious, but making sure they fall actually from the self-assessment, so they relate really clearly to the self-assessment that you've just done, and also the performance indicator or indicators that you've chosen and selected there. the goal needs to, again, just relate to developing competence rather than just doing something that you normally would do in everyday practice. So, for that new graduate, for example, it might be the goal could be to complete a specific training or to confidently kind of engage in the risk assessment process. Yeah, but making sure that it does kind of evidence a development or kind of growth in practice. Now, a goal needs to be listed for each competency area within the first 3 months of practice. And as I mentioned before, there's an expectation that there's a goal in progress throughout the cycle until a goal for each of the areas has been completed. And we would expect with 5 goals that would take around that 2-year kind of cycle length. In terms of additional goals, so some people might engage in their goal and professional development activities and then realize that there are actually additional things that they need or want to be doing. So people then have the option of adding in an additional goal if they want to. You do not need to do that. The only situation where a goal is required, an additional goal rather, is required, is if you discontinue a goal. So, for example, if you leave a particular area of practice and that goal is no longer relevant, then you would need to outline that, which we'll talk about in a second, in the outcomes and changes in critical reflection section, and add in an additional goal. So if you do discontinue a goal that does not count as a completed goal, you will need a new goal. Cool. Thanks, B. Professional development activities. So these need to be discrete from the goal itself. So if your goal is to provide supervision to an occupational therapist, then your professional development activity cannot be to provide supervision to an occupational therapist. So the professional development activities are the discrete steps that you need to complete in order to achieve your goal. So it might be, for example, completing some specific supervision training, having a conversation with your professional lead around kind of the process. So they need to be discrete from the goal itself. How many activities there are really does depend on the goal. So 1 to 3 generally is adequate and kind of a good number of activities. And when you're thinking about your professional development activities, it's thinking about the different layers of learning. So there might be a development activity around knowledge acquisition, and then one about applying it into practice, and then one around evaluation. But again, that will depend on the kind of goal that you've set. But thinking about those different layers and having those as separate activities, and just making sure that you list your development activities in separate fields as well. So sometimes in ePortfolios, there might be one development activity that actually has, I'm going to go on XYZ training and then apply that in practice and then talk about it in supervision. That would be 3 different development activities. So just making sure you list them out in separate fields. And if there are any that you discontinue, then commenting on that in the outcomes and critical reflection section. So in terms of expectation, so once we start a new cycle, so within 3 months, alongside your self-assessment and goal, you should have one set of development activities recorded. So for whatever goal that you're starting on first, there is an expectation that you would have the professional development activities listed for that particular goal as the bare minimum. You might also do the other goals. There just needs to be at least one set. So professional development activities for one of the competencies within that first 3 months. Thanks, B. Now, the outcomes and changes to practice. So really that's statements of completion of your development activity. So that you describe whether or not you have engaged in your development activities, and then what the impacts of engaging within that activity was or are. So that might be impacts upon your practice. It might be feedback from people that you're working with. So it can include a broad range of perspectives there. The important thing is to be recording what the outcomes actually are. So not hypothetical, what you think might happen if you do this particular goal or activity, but actually what were the actual outcomes and changes to your practice and impacts upon others. And giving specific examples of what they were in terms of those changes. So not just that karataki have benefited, but you might have received particular feedback, or you might be doing things in a more effective or efficient way. You might have received feedback from your manager. So giving some specific examples to kind of justify, I guess, the outcomes that you're talking about. And if the outcome, sometimes when we engage in goals or professional development activities, the outcome is actually unexpected or it wasn't quite what we thought it would be. And if that is the case, then you just write that. So you don't need to, it doesn't need to be all rainbows and butterflies. It's really about outlining what did happen. So you might set a goal and engage in some development activities, and actually it didn't really result in any change to your practice. You would detail that within your outcome section, that actually the outcomes that happened were this rather than this. And then that would give you something to reflect on within your critical reflection section. So outcomes generally is, I guess, best to be recording them responsively. So every completed goal and when you've completed development activities should have outcomes filled out. Again, any rationale if you're discontinuing any goals for whatever reason, or if you do get to the end of the cycle and you haven't engaged in any of the professional development activities, so anything that's incomplete, documenting the rationale for that there too in the outcome section. And just making sure that if you are, again, uploading any evidence, that you do have consent to do that if you need, and that the evidence that you do upload protects the confidentiality and privacy of other people. Thanks, B. And the critical reflection section is really where you pull it all together. So I guess it's the way that we make sure that the rest of the sections aren't just kind of tick boxes, that actually you're thinking about the impacts and change upon your practice and for other people, and really demonstrating, extending, thinking fully upon all of the different kind of learnings and insights that you've uncovered. Often when we do that, we come up with new areas for development, which can then feed into the new cycle. The critical reflection, so they should obviously link back to the self-assessment and the indicators that you've described. And also there might be additional layers of learning or insights, things you've uncovered that are relevant within that section as well. So kind of reflecting more broadly upon yourself and your practice context. And critical reflection, so completing those for each completed goal, again, as well as goals that have been discontinued. And if you are discontinuing a goal and you're writing that in the outcomes and critical reflection section, and you're needing to come up with that additional goal, which you will be if you've discontinued a goal, then that would be the space where you're kind of explaining and completing, I guess, the next self-assessment for whatever the next goal might be. Cool, thanks, B. Now, there are times, obviously, where practice necessarily isn't straightforward. You don't just stay in the same role for 2 years. So there are different, I guess, rules or kind of things that apply within different kind of variances to a standard cycle. So if you do change roles, whenever that might be, important just to update your employment and contact details. If you change roles within the final 6 months of a cycle, it would generally be fine for you just to complete the cycle as is, and then to be starting afresh in the new ePortfolio cycle in relation to your new role. But if you're changing roles within the first half of an ePortfolio cycle, then really important to go back through what you have for self-assessment and your goals and professional development activities, and reviewing and updating to make sure they are still relevant for the remainder of the cycle within your new practice area. Sometimes that might mean you need to discontinue goals and complete additional goals. And other times it might just be a slight variance to your self-assessment, but the goal and development activities are still relevant. So that really depends on what the change is. When we're thinking, so the blue box now around periods of non-practice, so people who go away on mat leave or have a career break or kind of some, overseas for a few months. It's just documenting that in your ePortfolio, and where you document that will change. So if you've had, a year of an ePortfolio before you go on mat leave, we would expect that you would have completed some of the goals and development activities. And so it's doing the outcome and reflection sections for that. And then in the goals that are incomplete, it might be writing there that you haven't had a chance yet for XYZ reasons, and you're now away on mat leave for X amount of time. Generally really useful to have, if you are going on a practice break, to have that information in the Competency 1 self-assessment, just so it's really clear and it's the first thing that you see. And also that can be documented in the other sections, as I've just talked through, where appropriate as well. And lastly, so beginning practice at the end of a cycle. So we have new grads who graduated last year in December who have commenced with the 2026-2028 cycle. So rather than needing to do the 2024 to 2026 cycle, which is what we're in now, they have automatically started within the 2026 8 cycle. And that's the same for people who register. So from December 1st last year, anyone who registers after that point will start with this new cycle. But other people, it will really depend on when you first register and start practicing, when you do get your practicing certificate, as to what's practical within that cycle. So, for example, if you started practicing in September last year, then you've got those 3 months at the end of the year and until April this year. So you've got a good 7 months to actually complete some goals around orienting to practice or making kind of professional networks, etc. So we would expect that within a 7-month time frame, there is actually time to be working on some shorter term goals. Cool, thanks, B. Now, in terms of timeline, so next week, actually today, I think, Tuesday next week will be when the new ePortfolio cycle opens. So that will be Wednesday next week, I correct myself. So you can start thinking around self-assessments and goals and development activities for the new cycle. Now, this year you'll have until April the 30th, so you'll have a month to be finishing up the current cycle. And on April the 30th, the current cycle will become read-only, so you will no longer be able to edit that. In July, so whoever has started a ePortfolio cycle on the 1st of April, July 1st is the date where you need to have self-assessment and goal for each competency area, your development activities recorded for at least one competency area, and your supervisor nomination accepted. If somebody starts, so you'll see the we all within the first 3 months of practice. So if somebody starts in May, they will then have 3 months to complete that. And so their date will be August 1st. So within the first 3 months of a cycle is the key for that part there. And again, within the first 6 months is when your supervisor statements need to be completed. So for those who start on the April 1st for the 2026-2028 cycle, October the 1st is the date that you'll need to have the supervisor statements done. Thanks, B. Now, the roles of the third party and ePortfolio supervisor. So we should all be very familiar with the third party with the current time of year. So that is a one-off attestation that somebody needs to make in regards to your fitness and competence and the appropriateness of your ePortfolio. That attestation is a short-term thing, so it is there to allow you to get a practicing certificate, and anyone who you nominate as a third party can either accept or decline that. There is no ongoing relationship. So once they've done that attestation, that is it. And we need the person who is the third party to be a professional peer. So somebody who is a registered practicing kaiwhakaora ngangahau, who has a current practicing certificate and who does not have any conditions on their scope and who are not engaged in a research program. The ePortfolio supervisor, so similar to the third party, they can accept or decline any nomination. And they need to complete statements which relate to fitness and competence and your engagement in the ePortfolio. That, as we know, so there is an ongoing relationship, though, with your ePortfolio supervisor. Sometimes that spans the full 2-year cycle, and at other times that will not. It depends on lots of different factors, but that is an ongoing relationship. Now, who can be your ePortfolio supervisor will depend on who you are. So if you're on a recertification program, for example, then you won't be able to have somebody who's also on a research program. So have a look at the supervisor standards as to who can be your ePortfolio supervisor, and they're online under the supervision resource, the professional resources, practitioner resources rather. And speaking of resources, we have just updated a whole lot. So we have 3 different user guides. So for kaiwhakaora ngangahau, so for everyone who is working as an occupational therapist, which talks you through the kind of the technical how-to of all of the different parts of the ePortfolio. And we have a guide for occupational therapists who are supervisors, and then a guide for people who are not practicing occupational therapists in New Zealand, who are acting as a supervisor for a kaiwhakaora ngangahau practicing in New Zealand. So 3 different user guides which have slightly different information to fit what that person will need to do. And we have also just released, hopefully you've seen in the Pānui and on our social media, an updated ePortfolio guide, which includes the content that we've discussed today, and has some examples in terms of what's required for, or what could be appropriate for professional development activities and outcomes, etc. So take a look at that. Now that all of these resources are available. So on the main OTBNZ website, if you click on the menu, they're all under practitioner resources, and then ePortfolio is the first page that pops up. If you're in the My OTBNZ practitioner portal, if you click on that ePortfolio information tab, it'll take you to that same page. So all of these resources are available on that page. We've got our policies that relate to the ePortfolio there as well. Thanks, B. All right, Q&A. So I can see Tony's name there. So I'll invite Tony.
All right, so now we've reached the Q&A portion of the webinar. We do have a couple of questions here. The first one is a 3-pronged partai. First question is, as a new graduate, do your supervision hours need to be logged before the renewal of your practicing certificate? I can read the second part as well and the third part if you're okay with me doing that now. Yep. So second question is, does my ePortfolio need to be done before I can apply for my APC? And the third part is, if your first job as a new grad was a short fixed-term contract and you haven't been signed off for weekly supervision, then how do I state this when applying for my new APC, as it'll still need to say new grad?
Okay, wow, there's an awful lot in that. Okay, so let's start with supervision logs. So these can be logged via your My OTBNZ portal, and they will be looked at the time you make your application for the removal of recertification. It's not really part of the application for your new annual practicing certificate. They are separate things. So we need to treat them as separate things. The thing you need to remember is that when your removal of certification program is removed, it will come off your practicing certificate. So you would be able to print a new practicing certificate that did not show it. Right, ePortfolio. When did you start work? That really comes down to what needs to be done in your ePortfolio prior to making your application or having a third party make that attestation. If you've been engaged in ePortfolio for the 2 years, then at this stage of the month, we would hope you were nearing the end and writing your outcomes and critical reflections. And that really is what the third party should be attesting to that you've done. Your new job, the next part was about first job as a new grad, is that right? On a fixed term contract. And you haven't had your weekly supervision signed off. Have you input it into your My OTBNZ? Do you have records of it that you can input into your My OTBNZ? Did you actually have the weekly supervision? I possibly need some more information to ask that, so to answer that question. So I'd seriously encourage you to contact inquiries at otboard.org.nz.
I think I might just add, Tony, and you've said this already, but just to make it really clear, is that when we talk around the annual practicing certificate renewal, that's a very different process to being on a recertification program. So they both reference recertification, but they're actually really different things. So have a look at the research program guide, which we've also just updated. which is really clear around what your responsibilities are under that, including weekly supervision. And those are responsibilities that they're not just kind of nice to do's. If you are engaged in a recertification program, you need to be meeting the requirements, or there needs to be a very good reason why you're not. So as Tony says, it might be useful just to reach out. But they are very different processes. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Cool. The next question relates to, if we're currently unemployed, do we state that in the self-assessment of the start of the ePortfolio? Also, if unemployment would be until after July 1st, how do we indicate that we can't complete those requirements in June or July?
Okay, there's a couple of things there. If you're unemployed, technically you're not needing to be engaged in the ePortfolio. However, we would recommend that you open the cycle and you put in there that you're unemployed, especially if you're obtaining a practicing certificate or have a practicing certificate for the 2026-27 year. Basically, that can then sit there, and when you do gain employment, from your start date of employment, you have 3 months then to repopulate with your self-assessment and any development goals and activities you want. Okay, so the 1st of July becomes somewhat unnecessary for someone in that condition.
Without that information too, I think it's about remembering that we have no idea what you're doing or not doing. And so really spell it out for us so that, for example, if you are kind of registered for an audit, or you do get picked for an audit, that we can look straight into it and say, oh, you're actually not currently working. Or if, I guess there's no harm in spelling it out and making it really clear. The other part is what's written in your ePortfolio needs to align with what's in your My OTBNZ portal in terms of your employment information. So it's really helpful if there isn't an employment detail there to have a statement in your ePortfolio that justifies why that is the case.
All right. How does third-party attestation work in regards to signing off fitness to practice / competence, and you answer a question about any performance management plan in place or concerns for practice? What happens if third-party sign-off person isn't aware of professional concerns?
I mean, that's a very valid question. You can't make a declaration you don't know about. We would hope that anyone applying for their practice certificate would actually provide that information for us. And there are situations when a third party won't know about those kind of things. Some people keep those very private. That's all taken into account. You won't be held accountable for making a false declaration or anything like that. You're only as good as the information you have to make the declaration.
And the declaration, I think, is the first statement is to the best of my knowledge or something along those lines. So, yeah.
Thank you. And there's a question here. They've tried to contact us but got no response to the contact details listed online. Is there a number I can call to discuss further?
Okay. We have our 0800 number, which is 0800 997755. I think the point to make at this time is we are in the middle of APC period. We are extremely busy. The phones, while they are monitored, often we're on the phones answering other people's questions. So we do encourage you to leave messages. We have a 24-hour turnaround on those messages. Alternatively, send your email to inquiries@otboard.org.nz. And even in those emails, if you prefer to discuss it, then provide us contact details and we will get in touch with you.
Thank you, Tony. We don't have any more questions open, so we might leave the line open for another minute or so to get your questions in. Anything else you guys would like to add in the meantime? Do you guys want to remind everyone about the timeline? Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess just to reiterate these timeframes. So really important now that you're focusing on your current cycle, that you're finishing that off. because on April the 30th, that does become read-only and you will not be able to access that anymore. From the 1st of April, you then have access to and can open up that new ePortfolio cycle, and you've got 3 months until you need to have your self-assessment, your goal, and a set of development activities for each competency. Sorry, self-assessment and a goal for each competency, and then at least one set of development activities. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Got another question. Can your ePortfolio supervisor also be your third party?
Do you want to take this one,
Yeah,
Naomi?
yes, they can. And also, I guess our encouragement in it is that it's not the same person. If you have, I guess, two, in some practice settings, you may only have one person who can make those attestations and act as your supervisor. And for many of us, our peer networks, or we have systems that are wider than that. So we might have a supervisor and then a professional lead, for example, or another professional peer that can attest to our practice. The reason that I guess we encourage people to have different third parties and supervisors is that it just gives you another layer of somebody attesting to your fitness and your competence if you do ever need that. And it is, I guess, just making sure that you're utilising and that you are putting effort into having kind of a fuller professional network than just one person as well. I guess the other part of that, sorry, is if you have a third party, they're both looking at their ePortfolio, and so it gives opportunity for some different perspectives there around the content of your ePortfolio.
Thank you. Another question. New grad here. What if your employer said that you don't need to worry about writing your goals within the first 3 months of employment?
It's not your
Okay,
it's not your employer that sets the standards that are
the
required in terms of
standard.
ePortfolio, would be my answer to that.
Yeah, and I would suggest that I'd encourage you as an individual to read the new documentation that's come out recently around ePortfolio and the guidance material provided in there. Who knows, you may be able to teach your supervisor something.
See, final call for any party, please.
Just going to add one
Oh,
comment onto that.
yeah,
Sorry, B. Just an
you can.
afterthought, but the ePortfolio, that's really your professional responsibility. And so making sure your details are up to date and that you're engaging in what you need to is your responsibility as an individual clinician, regardless of what other people around you are saying.
Mm.
Yeah.
And just on that, as the manager of registrations, I'd strongly encourage you to ensure that your contact information is always up to date. You would far rather prefer a phone call from one of us if we don't understand something that's going on than a big long email that sounds more official than the situation warrants. Okay? So it's your responsibility to ensure that we can contact you by a number of means.
There are a couple more questions. There's more of a comment, really. The website is really tricky to navigate and quite confusing. Maybe I'm not computer savvy. Is there a plan to update it and make it user-friendly?
Yeah, I'll take that one. There are plans in place to make changes to it, but we can only make changes when we understand what's causing problems. So if you are experiencing problems with the website and finding things and the rest of it, then feel free to send feedback around that to the inquiries team, and we'll build that into the refresh when we do that later this year.
Thank you. So should OTs have reflections done before asking for third-party sign-off?
Do you want to talk to this, Tony? Otherwise, I can.
I don't mind. You can.
So the third party that is happening for the nomination and third party declarations that are happening now, you should have you've got a 1 week left within your ePortfolio cycle. So unless there's a specific reason, like you've just only started practice, you should have a full ePortfolio. If you're wondering about the supervisor statement, so in case there is any confusion around that, so that's a different process. Your ePortfolio supervisor should be discussing with you and this is one of the things that they attest to around your self-assessment and goals and development activities to make sure they are appropriate for your practice.
Oh, thank you very much. If there are no other questions, we might close off with a karakia. for your colleagues who may have missed this webinar, this is recorded and will be up on YouTube following the event. Naomi, please.
Thanks, Bea. So me karakia tātou, kia whakaria te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia tūra ki whakataha ai, kia tūra ki whakataha ai, haumie, huie, tā kia.
Thank
Thank you
you,
everyone for attending.
Thanks.